think. Uh, is the mic working? Yeah, good to go. Okay, a very good evening to you today. Our audience here and everyone who's joined us online for this event. I know it's late in the day and it's coming towards the end of COP26, so it's wonderful to see so many faces here. I'm Professor Tassine Jaffrey, and I'm the Director of the Centre for Climate Justice at Glasgow Caledonian University, and I'm joined this evening by a wonderful set of speakers representing young people, Indigenous groups, women and girls on the front line of the climate crisis. And our focus is on climate change, climate justice, and a burgeoning mental health crisis. Globally, there is very little research that pays attention to the mental health impacts of climate change. The lack of data makes this a prolific and least understood area of study. The limited evidence base is a major barrier to addressing the problem. The knowledge and evidence gap that exists currently cuts across two domains: the health data set and the social data set, and more explicitly, the social and climate justice data set, human rights, climate inequality. And these two data sets need to fundamentally come together to help us make sense of the size and scale of the problem, but also to help us develop solutions that are much needed on the ground. So the focus of this event today, this evening, is to put the spotlight on the lived experiences of women's mental health and climate change experiences. We will then explore the development of a research framework for building further insights into how we tackle this knowledge gap. And third, we will discuss what needs to be done in terms of policy and practical solutions that can support the mental health needs of women and girls, as well as protecting their human right to life. So with that, I'm absolutely honoured and delighted to have our first speaker with us, Ashley Komanyapik Rose Cummings. She is an Indigenous rights activist for Inuit communities in Canada. She's a member of the Canadian Prime Minister's Youth Council, and she will be joining us online to just talk us through some of her experiences and that of the Inuit communities on the mental health crisis of climate change. So over to you, Ashley, if you can hear us. Welcome, and please, over to you. Thank you.
Kuya Namig, thank you. Unukut atiga komangapik, panil tumutayanga kisianimana White Horse Mipunga. Good evening. My name is Ashley Cummings. My traditional name is Komangapik. I'm from Pangertung, Nunavut, Canada, and I'm currently living in Whitehorse, Yukon, Canada. As an Inuk woman, I feel it's very important for me to give context to how I exist in this world. My story is not unique at all, and it's the story of many Inuit and Indigenous folks as well, especially here in North America, in Canada. My hometown is very small, about 1,500 people, and much of everyone's lives are spent out on the land. And when the weather is nice, whether that's clear skies at minus 25 Celsius or overcast at 20 Celsius, as much time as possible is spent enjoying the land, hunting, gathering, enjoying each other while we're on the land as well. An unfortunate part of this is with colonialism came exclusion. The land is now accessed by those who can afford to do so. Not everyone can when poverty rates are so high in rural and northern Canada. We were forced into small communities and taken away from the nomadic lives we had lived for thousands of years. That took a toll on our mental health to begin with. On top of this exclusion, our land is changing vastly. Glaciers are melting, animals are found with enormous amounts of garbage in their stomachs. Our own garbage is typically burned instead of shipped out to be recycled or taken care of by other means of waste management. Because of these changes, our cultures and well-being are changing too. I grew up with caring uncles and hilarious aunts and loving parents. And despite that, I still suffer from depression and anxiety. Just weeks ago, I was hospitalized for a mental health breakdown. Fortunately, I live in a small city now with all the amenities I need on top of excellent access to land, as I live in a small, quiet cabin just outside of the city. I access where my well being is best, even if it's not my traditional territory when I am out on these lands here. Many Inuit cannot access appropriate mental health care after such breakdowns, and we have few counselors in our regions and do not have addiction services existing in a culturally appropriate manner, which we do have issues with addiction as well. Inuit have suicide rates at 11 times higher than the rest of Canada. And for young Inuit men, these rates are cited as much as 48 times higher based on some studies. These are people who are being further marginalized by the government's lack of action on climate change, as well as a lack of drive for basic needs such as food and drinking water. I'm here to hold my government accountable, and thank you for hearing me.
Thank you, Ashley. And it's heartbreaking to hear your story there and your personal journey, and also it's sad to hear that you've had to that you have had a recent mental health breakdown. And I personally wish you speedy recovery, and we're here to support you in any way that we can. And we're going to do that support just by having this conversation at this event at COP26, and we hear your voice, and we are with you. So you've provided some, really meaningful and powerful insight there with the suicide rates. It's astonishing. What I would like to do, thank you, Ashley, for your contribution, is now introduce to you Peter Gondway, who's the Executive Director of Life Concern organisation based in northern Malawi. This is an organisation that we currently are working with on trying to get some evidence and data on the mental health impacts of climate change. And he's going to introduce a short video that he has recorded for us to hear. So a very good evening to you, Peter, if you're there. Welcome to this event. If you would like to say a few words, and then we will show the video that you've kindly put together for us.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tassin, for giving me such type of opportunity to speak at this wonderful meeting. And I'm ready, and I'm happy to be part of this panelist. You can show the video, then I think I'll speak after the video. Thank you.
Ine ndine Linda Phiri, kumira muzi wa Rowoka, Chief Principal Chimalavantu, TA Mwamkunikira.
My name is Linda Phiri from Chimalavantu Village, Traditional Authority Mwamkunikira, here in Rumpe District. I am 42 years and I have 8 children. I was really affected by the floods. Imagine my 2.5 acres of land was washed away. I grew groundnuts, maize and soya beans, but everything was gone. I did not harvest anything. I'm just staying as I am. I was really affected because what happened was a disaster on my life. Look at my family. How can I survive with such a big family without food? Then I started doing some piece works to feed my family. One part of me was telling me to kill myself, while the other part wanted me to get divorced. But through perseverance, I managed my situation up to now. Imagine having 8 children with no food on the table. What was I supposed to do? Oh, my parents are dead. I have nowhere to get the money. The major cause is that people are cutting down trees carelessly, a situation which has led to soil erosion, leading to floods. As I'm talking, I lost 6 chickens to floods. The whole kitchen was full of water. My house developed cracks because of these floods. After the incident, there was no peace in my family. When there is no food in the house, children suffer, you know that. We received rice, salt, beans, and a basin. We faced a lot of abuse from chiefs. They told us to share our relief items with other people that were not affected by the floods. At the moment, I'm still facing a lot of challenges in my life. When I get money, I invest in my potato selling business. I pay school fees for my child who is at a community-based secondary school. Things are not okay with this coronavirus. Look at how the environment has been destroyed, and the coming in of coronavirus is making our lives very difficult. You can't make money through business because people also have no money at the moment. I sell potatoes, but the pandemic has disturbed a lot of things in our day-to-day life. People no longer buy things. There is a lot of gender-based violence in our families, communities. Men are not supporting us. For instance, my husband has been sick, he's psychiatric, for a long time. He can no longer support me. That means I have to look after the whole family, myself. There are a lot of abuses in these houses. Men are no longer supporting us. I have been abused by my husband. I have been patient up to now. He has been beating me, but with the coming in of non-governmental organizations, now he has stopped. I need food. I need money for school fees. I need financial support for my businesses.
Chakwamba kuti vanifizira mwana fizi ningakondwa chomene. Then ine nani kuti vanipasa support ya kupanga top up business yani na kuningasangara chomene. Ine ndine Linda Phiri kufumira muzi wa Rowoka, Chief Principal
Thank you.
Mabantu, TA Magwini.
My name is Linda P.
Thank you, Peter. I wonder if you could just spend 1 or 2 minutes just describing, just describing how difficult it is to conduct research in this area.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tassin. Indeed, disasters in Malawi and Lumbi district where I come from, every year we experience disasters because of climate change. And usually we experience some floods, landslides, and storms. And whenever these things happens, usually we go to the communities and we support them with the relief items. But there are two problems which we don't address usually, and most organizations, they don't address those problems. That's gender-based violence and issues of mental health. Because people are traumatized, people are affected, gender-based issues, they are rampant, and yet no organization addresses these problems. So people, they suffer with mental health issues within their minds, and nobody comes in to address those problems because we are always looking at the relief part of it. We want to see people, they should have food in their houses. What are they going to eat? What are they going to dress? But we forget about gender-based issues. We forget about mental health issues. So at the end of the day, the story of Linda, you find that Linda wanted to commit suicide after the disasters because she lost everything. And yet no one talks about that suicide issue. No one addresses that problem. So this is the challenge that at least together, we need to look at it as development partners to see what can we do in relation to mental health whenever we have disasters in the communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. And your voice is loud and clear. The message that video, the farmer there, that she was, it's so heartbreaking. And I think it's so abundant, as you said there. We're looking at, growing crops. We're looking at all infrastructure, but we're forgetting about the invisible, what you can't see, which is a mental health crisis that is burgeoning due to climate change. And what I would like to do is now hand over to Jacinta Silakan, because she is sitting in front of our audience here, and she has experienced firsthand what it's like to deal with gender-based violence and mental health. And I know it's hard to talk about that in just a few minutes, but she'll convey some very important and key messages, which I think the world needs to hear. Jacinta.
Thank you very much. My name is Jacinta Silakan. I come from Kenya, an organization called Sangida Foundation, which advocates for the rights of women and children with disabilities. My story is I come from the Maasai community, and I experienced GBV firsthand as I got married at an age of 12 years. My sister, who is elder, got married at 9 years, and she accepted to stay in marriage. I stayed in marriage for 11 days. I was married for 11 days, then I ran away and went back to school. I completed my college, and my father and my relatives had nothing to do with me because of disrespecting them. And then after I finished college, I got a job. Then I got married to someone that I loved, and then I had a child, and this child had disabilities. And the community could not forget. They said that I got a child with disabilities because I disrespected my father. So it became a burden, and my child was called a child of sin. And since then, I've been going through trauma, I've been going through stigma and discrimination. No one talks about, no one wants to know what you're going through as a mother with a child with disabilities. They imagine everything is okay. They just imagine, okay. They never want to know. No one finds out, how are you? How do you cope with a child with disabilities? These is the stories that I and many other mothers with children with disabilities go through among the pastoralist communities. There is no forum, there is no voice, there is no platform for us to be heard and to be listened to. With climate change, it makes it even worse because now the droughts are becoming worse, and it takes even worse for for a mother with a child with disabilities, because the rest of the family, they will move with their cows. So they will move away with the resources. And then the mother with a child with disabilities will be left alone with no resources. So this mother will see her child every day dying of starvation. They get severely malnourished. They have nothing to do. You can imagine the trauma of that mother, seeing her child fading away every day until one day when they die. These are the trauma, these are the things that people don't talk about. We are talking about the big things, and yet the things that matter, the mental status of those women is what matters a lot. And I have not heard in this COP26 people talking about the mental status of people, and especially people with disabilities. Mental health is important. Mental health is real. We are going through issues, and these things need to be addressed right now. It's now, it's now, it's urgent. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacinta. And my heart goes out to you. And you're very, very brave to have come through your journey. And I find it hard personally to be able to chair this event and this conversation, because these women that we're speaking to, they're not just presenters for me on this panel. Indeed, they are my friends and colleagues. So it's challenging to run this conversation. But like I said at the beginning, we don't have the evidence. We don't have the baseline. This is a conversation that is missing across all of COP. It's never been raised, and we have to talk about this to protect women and come up with solutions that will give them the support that they need. And in terms of, so Peter and Ashley, I'll come back to you just shortly, but in terms of getting the support we need that evidence base, we need that insight. So I would like to introduce Runa Khan. She's founder and executive director of Friendship, an international social purpose organisation supporting remote vulnerable communities in Bangladesh. So I'm sure in Bangladesh, also Runa, you have heard many accounts of the trauma that women are experiencing. But I wonder if on this occasion, you can maybe talk us through, how do we begin to get this evidence base off the ground? Where do we need to start with this? It's such a difficult thing. Where do we begin?
Thank you very much, Tasin. I think today's panel is extremely important, because at the forefront of everything is that one individual. And it's that one individual that in these big communications and in these big conferences and people communicating on, they forget. And every life matters. I mean, we need to start with that responsibility. So 20 years, I've been working with climate migrants. 20 years, I never said that we work with women only or with children only. We work with everyone. in doing everyone, what do we find? We find providing health, 80% women, providing education, 60% are women, providing those who need aid and relief, 80%, 85% are women. How does this happen? When we have governance work, when there is something which broke my heart, and I understand, because what we saw during this COVID time, all my 20 years of work seemed to be for nothing, because child marriages just skyrocketed. Nupur, 14-year-old, father can't feed her because they've got 4 children, marry them off. 20 years older, father's friends, she's married off. You know, you have old men, you have even young men who know, aware that they shouldn't marry, but they marry once, twice, 3 times, leave the wives, go away. Result, fistula operation, for example, if a woman needs it, socially totally ostracized because of the migration during climate events, they cannot have it. Whole life, an 18-year-old girl can be socially ostracized. And this is a reality. And you come, Tahseen, as you said, we come from a place where there are no data available. We work with gender-based violence. You know, we have the Rohingya communities, 1 million people there. We have people in these migrant communities. We are kind of working with 7 million people are accessing our services every year. But in this, the most difficult part is GBV and mental health, because we really do not have any mark on which to start and how to approach these people. Over the last 2 years, we have been working very strongly with this, with the GBV, women, and also with mental health issues, MHPSS, and we found that working through the communities or with people who the communities are trusting has started to bring in results. So we make people within the communities the operational or the heads, and then because they get the trust of the communities a lot more than anyone coming, and these are things you don't speak on. And when an organization or an academic field comes in, or from research they come in, or people want to hear, it is just impossible to actually get the truth. So we started bottoms up, community women telling community. And then we have a supervisor who would go and get data from there. And then that would move up to another level, incorporated. We found within our little scope, 68% of the women have got some sort of a mental issue, some difficulties, either tackling children. I have had women coming to me with a child saying, doctor has said there is nothing I can do. Should I kill my child? Because she just doesn't know what to do. You see? And these are things we are faced with daily. These are things that we see daily. And it is impossible to work on something a bit more global, a bit more national, unless we have pure scientific data to work on. You can go and ask any questions in the field. You will get a lot of answers. You think you can base your evidence on those replies. It doesn't work like that. I give you a little example. Once I go into a community, and I ask, how many children do you have? Two. Everybody's got 2 kids. The whole island is filled with children, hardly any grown-ups. Then I asked, okay, how many children do you have? Actually, do you have any child beyond these 2? Oh yes, 2 of them are married. I have another infant in the house. So there are 5 kids, I get 2. This is the reply which continuously happens, and difficulties of collection of data. So thank you very much for bringing up this such important, work to the forefront.
Thank you, Runa, for that. And before I turn my attention to Steve Trent, who's the CEO of the Environmental Justice Foundation, who'll give us some insights into collecting, not collecting, but pulling together that evidence and insight, particularly for those who have migrated due to climate change. It's another layer of complexity. But I'm wondering, before I go on to Steve, Ashley, if you're still with us, if I can rope you back into the conversation just now. Ashley, can you give us some thoughts from your perspectives, from your experiences? Where do you think we should be starting in terms of generating that evidence and that insight from a climate justice perspective? Because what we're hearing is that this is a huge injustice and a huge injustice on people's right to a decent quality of life. So Ashley, I wonder if I could bring you back into the picture and give us some thoughts on that.
Absolutely. I think that Inuit are such a prime example of the ways that mental health is really impacting people, especially in how tied it is to climate change and climate justice, especially growing up so connected with the land, growing up, spending as much time on it as possible. That was where I got a lot of my well-being, and that's where I continue to get a lot of my well-being. And even just seeing the mental health crisis that's happening for Inuit right now, for Indigenous groups across the Arctic, I think it's evident that our climate is changing so deeply. And of course, that's impacting us. Who are we without our land and without our culture? They're intertwined. They can't be taken apart. I'm so thankful that I am very connected with the land, and we need to continue supporting that. But with the climate change and climate justice, it just gets more and more exacerbated on our mental health because, we can't access the land as much as we would like, if we have the means to even do that. And then the lack of action on the government's part, at least in Canada, is just so frustrating because I witnessed these changes firsthand. I witnessed trees falling over because there's too much snow in this desert climate in Whitehorse. I see so many different issues coming to light every day. Whereas when you're in larger cities, whether that's Toronto or Vancouver, you don't necessarily see it other than poor waste management, for example. And so Inuit are almost this unfortunate case study on how poorly our mental health is doing, how little access to resources we have, and how the government's inaction on climate change is continuing to exacerbate these issues and perpetuating all of these problems for Indigenous peoples who already don't have access to proper physical health care, let alone mental health care.
Thank you, Ashley, for that. And I'm wondering, as you're describing their case study, Peter, if you're with us, if you could just talk us through some of the challenges that we faced in setting up our research in northern Malawi to begin to document scientific evidence from the lived experiences that women are experiencing on the ground, and it kind of like lifts the conversation from what Runa has been explaining there, how hard it is to just get to that insight, but somehow we need to translate those stories into information that can be used by policy and decision makers. Peter, could you just give us a few steps as to what we're doing and the challenges that we faced in getting our study off the ground?
Yeah, indeed, there are a number of challenges. I think one of it is a lack of data. There's no available data in terms of mental health and GBV in relation to climate change, and that has been a challenge to us. So in setting up our research, what we did was to come up with the policymakers together so that at the end of the day, we can plan together and look at the issue critically to say, what are the real issues that are affecting the community in relation to climate change, but also we are looking at the GBV. So currently, I think we are having very good positive response from different types of stakeholders, policymakers from the government, and other even universities. They are coming in to support us, but also in the community. But now the challenge is when you go to the community, you talk about mental health. People, their mental health is associated with stigma and discrimination. So automatically, people, they will not talk about mental health directly. But if you look at the issues of gender-based violence, but also associated issues that are relating to climate, to mental health, people are able to mention. issues of trauma, issues of suicide and the like, then you are able to link up to say, yes, I think there are some mental health issues in the community. So currently, our study, we have started with the baseline, looking at the two communities which have been heavily affected with the climate change, the intellectual part of Malawi, Chalo area, and the other area which has also been affected with floods, as you have seen the video, the community where Linda comes from. So these are the two study areas that we are focusing on. And at the end of the day, we want to see, maybe we can also come up with the data that other people, policymakers can also start using. Because currently, even when you are looking at the response initiatives, they don't address mental health issues because we don't have data. So that's the major challenge. I believe the research that we are going to do will lead us, it's a step ahead towards addressing mental health issues in our country, Malawi. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. And indeed, it is. You know, it was. I'll have to be very honest. Just to get a small study off the ground has taken an enormous amount of time, an enormous amount of energy, and an enormous amount of convincing, which is very, very hard when these stories are so real, but also very hard to convey to others, to say, we need to get this work done. We need that insight, because if we don't have it, then we are facing a burgeoning mental health crisis for women and girls. So we will have an opportunity for questions from the floor. But what I would like to do is just ask Steve to come in quickly. Steve Trent, CEO of the Environmental Justice Foundation, to give us a few perspectives on where do we even begin to look at the mental health crisis amongst those who are migrating and displaced due to climate change. Steve, a very warm welcome this evening.
Thank you very much. I think the first thing I want to say is thank you to my fellow speakers. I think it's very brave of you, and it's not easy. I can't imagine. So thank you for that. And for me, it's very important to learn to hear those voices. I think this has been one of the big lessons at COP26, that we need to hear more of these voices. And they need to be in the negotiating room, may I say. I think that is fundamentally important. I think the first thing that I wanted to put to this meeting was just to give some idea of the scale, actually, of what's happening, because I think we need to put it within the framework of what's going on. And so just a few key figures. If we look at what's been going on in reasonably near history, since 2008, weather-related hazards, which are increasing in frequency and severity as a result of the climate crisis, have forced over 21 million people to leave their homes each year. That's 41 people every minute. And that figure does not include those that are forced to flee due to slow onset climate events such as desertification and sea level rise. Now, for me, the critical point in this is that 95% of this displacement and 99% of all deaths resulting from weather-related disasters are occurring in developing countries. And you know, if you look at that and you understand that in the 20 countries that are deemed most vulnerable to the climate crisis are also mired in long-term conflicts, places including Yemen, Afghanistan, Democratic Republic of Congo, Somalia, all of which have large populations of internally and internationally displaced people. And then if we look into the future, we've heard from the Climate Action Tracker this week that the current actions that are being taken still put our planet on a path to a 2.4 degrees increase. So what does that mean? You know, these are kind of rather bland figures, but at 3 degrees of global heating, we will leave 3.5 billion people living outside of the historically habitable temperature niche for the human species. Now, when you think of people that are forced from their homes, and we've interviewed many in many different geographies around the world, talking to them, trying to understand the nature of their plight, how they're responding to it, what help they need, I confess we had not looked at the mental health dimension. And I think it is a huge gaping hole. I look at this and say, how can you access any healthcare? But mental health care in particular, it's important. When you've been forced from your home, you've lost your livelihood, maybe you can't feed your children, you have been removed from the context of the geography you grew up in, the culture you grew up in. What does that do to your mental health? It's devastating. The other point that I think is very important, which has already been touched upon by one of the speakers, is the fact that it is women and children overwhelmingly that are being impacted by this. And we see that again and again and again. We witness these problems happening in any geography we look at. And it can be in actually wealthy developed countries and as well as those that are developing and have less economic resource. So I can't speak to this issue as a mental health expert, I'm not, but I can speak to this as somebody who has for the past 20 years documented what is happening to climate migrants, climate refugees, call them what you will, and the impact of our heating planet on primarily poor and vulnerable communities. And I think what it is crying out for is far greater ambition, far greater action. And I will finish where I started almost. We need to hear the voices of the people that you have brought together here at this meeting, at this convening, and to understand what the impacts are on each individual, on their well-being, on their security, on their ability to feed, clothe and house themselves, and on their mental health. And I hope that we can see far more action and far more money dedicated to these issues to allow us to develop the baseline studies, the scientific data and the framework, which will deliver the architecture, if you like, in which solutions can be developed and which answers can be given. So I'd like to thank you for inviting me today to speak. I feel unqualified, and I would actually like to hear much more from your fellow panelists. So thank you, and I will finish there.
Thank you, Steve. Indeed, the figures, though, that you've presented speak volumes, and it just puts the perspective on the scale, the unimaginable scale of the disaster that is upon us. And it's difficult when you hear figures like that. It's difficult to think about how we need to still be on the defensive to try and get work and funding to get this work off the ground, not just for the evidence, but indeed for the solutions and the support that is needed by women to get them through this crisis. So we'll open up to questions. If you have any questions for any of our panel members, please do raise your hand, and now's the opportunity to do that. If you would like to ask a question of Jacinta, Runa, Peter, Steve, Ashley, the floor is yours. Yep, there's a question at the back there. If you can, I want to try and get in as many questions as I can. So if you can say who you are and who you're representing, and then your question.
Let's see. Can you all hear me?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, perfect. Okay. Hi, my name is Karan. I'm an undergraduate student at Vanderbilt in Nashville in the United States. My question is, a lot of you mentioned how it's very important to amplify these stories, especially just, making sure that these voices are being heard. And I was wondering, what would you say are the best next steps to take beyond just looking at policy? Because I know you mentioned getting these voices in negotiations, but I think at the same time, it's also important that we engage in greater conversations and discourse beyond just looking at policy, and to achieve that cultural shift where mental health becomes something that we're more comfortable talking about collectively as people. I was just wondering where y'all think we should get started with that.
Yeah, thank you, Karen, for that. And if you don't mind, I'll direct it to one of my speakers, because then we can get in more questions that way. So I'm wondering, Jacinta, whether you could handle that question. So it is about going beyond policy. This is more about how do we talk more openly about mental health, particularly in difficult and challenging circumstances, and so you're not stigmatized.
For me, the best approach here is on sensitization of mental health to the community, to the grassroots level, so that everyone understands that mental health is not a stigma, because again, at the community, when you start talking about mental health, they will start thinking it is stigma. So, but when they are educated, when they are sensitized that you can open up, you can talk, bring people together as support groups so that they can support each other, then I think this issue of mental health will be better. Because for me, like, I went through for many years, maybe over 20 years, I didn't talk about what I was going through until one day when I got someone who took me through it, and I felt that it is very good. And I went back to the women, the support women group, and we came together and we started talking about our journey of what we go through as women with disability, with children with disabilities, and we felt like there was a relief. And so talking about it and sensitizing the women to keep talking about it, I think that is the first approach we should take. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacinta. Any other questions? We've got any other questions for any of our panelists from the audience here?
Hi, I'm Caroline. I work with Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders. And in a lot of the locations where we run medical or humanitarian aid projects. Can't hear? Can you hear me better now? Okay. Sorry. So in a lot of the locations where we run medical or humanitarian aid projects, we are seeing a growing burden of mental health. In a lot of the locations, there are also hotspots, climate hotspots, but it's very hard to set up a program that both gives you a baseline and then also can somehow find the attribution science. Do you have any advice?
Yes, I'm wondering if I could hand over to Runa on that, and then I will come back on that. Runa?
It's a mapping. So we do mapping of all the vulnerable climate impacted migrant movements, areas which are most impacted by the climate issues in Bangladesh. It's quite easy. You have all the rivers, you have the coastal belt, and you have some hauer lands, which are like flatlands, which become like the sea in summer. Those are the areas where you have the maximum climate impacts. Put the map of our working area are all there, and on that you put in the health issues. It's just a question of mapping. And I think it works fairly well doing that.
Yeah, I think what you're dealing with there in that situation is moving targets, right? And it's very, very hard to compile an evidence base when you're dealing with social construct and movement of people, because what you need the baseline for is to establish what's happening on the ground, and then to overlay that with solutions to try and establish change on the ground. But I think what is important is to include that in the approach and the methodology as you begin to understand the dynamics of on the ground. And I think, let's be honest about this. Just because it's a moving target doesn't mean to say we shouldn't try to begin to work on that. And like I said, the research in this area is so thin on the ground. I think at the moment, at best, what evidence is out there is scant, and it's in bits of literature. But what isn't out there is the evidence from the lived experiences. And however challenging it is, we need to start even if it means developing the approach, developing the methodology, and coming into this from an academic lens. It does take time. It's not something that can be rushed into, but if it's done well, then the results will speak for themselves.
Dasine, if I may just add something to this.
Sure.
It's a question of working in coordination and solidarity. You know, people working at the field with the academia, with the research scientists, with the climate scientists, with the researchers, you need to work in coordination. If you are going to work in silos, we will never get the results, you know? So I really believe that we're doing it that way also.
Thank you, Runa. Anyone else got a question for anyone for our panelists this evening? Any thoughts? Yep, there's a question at the back there.
So much to all the speakers. I'm Catherine. I was interested in the video about the influence of NGOs and sort of the positive outcomes of just like, I don't know if it was accountability, but in addressing gender-based violence. And I wonder if you could address sort of what are those enabling forces that NGOs on the ground, whether it's climate or environment or animal health or human health, can kind of do to create that positive norming, I guess.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm wondering, Peter, if I could bring you in here, because it relates to the video that we showed from Malawi. How do we look at this? Creating enabling forces. I guess what we're talking about is how do we create change on the ground? How do we use our insight into developing that positive support service and provision? And that's exactly what our research is about. Peter, could I bring you into the conversation to talk about where we intend to go once we have gone through the journey of collecting that evidence?
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you because of the question. One of the areas that we are looking at is organization. They are based, they are working with people and they stay with people in the communities and they are able to know the problems that people are facing. So currently, I think in our research, as Stasina said, we are also looking at the GBV as well as mental health. And what we are doing with mental health, we are working with medical team who are trained in relation to mental health issues to offer support services to those who have been those who are showing signs of mental health or they are raising challenges in relation to mental health, so that at least they can be helped and they can be supported. So at the end of the day, we'll be able maybe to come up with other methodologies to say whenever people are coming up with such type of problems, how do we address, how do we support them? Thank you.
But I'm also wondering if I could bring in Ashley, because she talks a lot about counselling and support service. And indeed, Ashley, you've had to reach out to counselling and support yourself, and really appreciate your personal experiences. But how hard, what's missing in terms of counselling and support as you see it for young people on the front line of climate crisis?
In many communities, mental health support doesn't even exist. In my hometown, we don't have any mental health nurses. We have a few social workers, but the turnover rate is very high. My mother was a social worker for many years and had to leave the job because of how stressful it is, especially in a small community where everyone knows everyone. And so there are so many different ways it's exacerbated because mental health care simply doesn't exist in rural and northern regions of Canada at the very least. You know, I'm lucky that I live in a bigger city, so I have access to a number of different healthcare, but you know, that's just me. That's not the thousands of other Indigenous youth that are suffering on, whether it's on reserve or in their isolated communities. There's just a lack of access entirely, and we need to change that. We've been needing to change that for decades. You know, my hometown, since 1999, the creation of Nunavut, has only had 1 year where no suicides happened in the community. That really shows how exhausting the existence can be without access to healthcare, whether this is through, you know, counseling services, addiction services, or simply having access to the land by being able to be supported, whether it's to buy gas to, you know, take your skidoo out on the land, or pay for someone's to borrow someone's boat for a couple hours, whatever it may be, that helps a lot. And unfortunately, even with our nutrition programs, Nutrition North Canada, it subsidizes certain foods that are essentially rotting because the produce freezes on its way north, whether it's being flown in or shipped in, and then it's essentially no good. So that's being subsidized, but it doesn't even take into account the traditional diets of Inuit. And so we eat entirely meat diets pretty much, especially in the winter. And so that adds that extra layer of stress where we're not eating what our body is, ancestrally streamlined to eat. And so that exacerbates the mental health crisis even more. There's so many layers, it's hard to know where to start, but at the very least, we can start supporting the people. And that needs at the very least.
Thank you, Ashley, for that. And yeah, we need to start supporting the people. I mean, you said it. You said it right here. Particularly women and girls, physically and mentally. Thank you, Ashley. We have another question down here at the front.
Thanks very much for your stories. It's really... Thanks very much for your stories. It's touched me, I think you've touched on the kind of services that would be helpful for women and girls, but I wonder what services would be helpful to work with men so that they can address their behaviour to prevent problems where that would be possible.
Thank you for that. And Jacinta, I wonder whether you could give us some perspectives on that.
Yeah. I think the solution here is to work closely with men, because many times they are the perpetrators. Among the pastoralist communities, we are a patriarchal society. The men are the decision makers. And as much as we want to empower women as much as possible, if we do not loop the men into these conversations, then there's nothing really much we are doing. So for me, it's also bringing men on board. Let them understand. Let's listen to them and work together. And then this probably GBV will reduce at least. Yeah.
Thank you. I'll come to Runa in a second. Steve, I wonder if I could loop you into the conversation here. If you'd heard the question right, how do we deal with men's behaviours? And I know you're not a mental health expert, but just from what you're seeing across the migration and displacement lens, could you have any perspectives on that?
Really, I don't have any critical insights other than to say, we do see the abuse taking place. I think while men can be victims too, they can suffer from the impacts of global heating and mental health. We see a lot of suicides. I think that was mentioned before, and we see a lot of bad behaviour. I think one of the critical things that I would highlight about this is that where you have the impact of climate change manifesting, it tends to interact with and magnify other stresses, and those can be social, economic, environmental stresses, obviously, and that's what can be the critical factor that pushes somebody over the edge. So I think I hate to say this being so reductionist, but coming back to our governments and saying more, better, faster. And as I mentioned before, I want to see finance going into this. We have the economic muscle available to us, certainly across the G7 and G20, and there should be more money put to this. And then the last point that I would say, which references this question and another question, is I think we have to address the mental health dimension with a coordinated, intelligent, culturally focused set of communications campaigns. We need the big picture at a global stage like COP26, and it's brilliant what you've done here, convening this panel and bringing these voices. But we also need campaigns at national, local, and micro levels to bring awareness and sensitize people about this issue. Without that, I think we will continue to see the problems and troubles that have been so eloquently described by my other speakers.
Thank you, Steve, for that. And it is certainly our intention to do whatever we can to mobilise work, research, social change to get the support that's needed off the ground. And whether it's and it's through campaigning, we need we need to work in those partnerships. It's a multi stakeholder, it's a multidisciplinary issue, and there's no one organisation that can do this together, but we will do what we can to push this conversation. So Runa, we have a question. I will direct that to you, I think, probably. Do we have...
Thank you. I'm Sofia. I'm from Chile. I'm sorry if my English is not the better. My question is, I work in an NGO about climate litigation, and my question is if any of the panelists has some approximation of the mental health in issues in climate litigation, because we work with communities, we work with a lot of women in climate litigation that suffer a lot of injustice, because you have like 5 or 10 years of litigation that it's really tiring and it's really devastating for the mental health, because you not always and the most of the times you don't have the results you want, and it's very depressing for us as advocates, and two, for the communities that sees that in this period of time of the litigation sees their environment being destroyed, and then they see that the justice in their countries, most of the countries in the global food don't have the results that should have. So do you have some approximation on that?
Thank you for that question, Runa. I wonder if you
Very
can take
briefly.
that. And I know you wanted to comment on the previous one as well.
Go
ahead.
little thing previous.
Please.
We have seen over 15% cases of sexual abuse with men happening in the Rohingya camps especially. So we have the gender-based violence and the GBV also geared for the men, not only for the women. But of course, women cases, as I said, was over 68%. So we need to deal with that. And regarding the litigations, climate migrants have litigation in many things. I mean, they need intervention, legal interventions in many things. As I say always, you cannot you need to understand the climate injustice before we go into climate justice. And this injustice is on them for health, for land issues, for domestic violence. They don't know where to go. So we start from the root. At the field level, we put in paralegal aids and link the paralegal aids to the mainstream government issues with our own system of having lawyers and who can carry it right up to the courts. But you are totally correct. It's extremely difficult, and many times the migrants are moving, so it doesn't continue. And the people who have, who are at fault, escape. And this is a very big issue. Thank you for bringing it up.
Thank you. And I'm just noting the time here. I mean, we're almost out of time, and indeed, an hour is not justice in itself to talk about this subject matter. But all that remains for me to do really is to give my sincere thanks to Ashley, to Peter, to Steve, to Jacinta, and to Runa. And I'm getting quite emotional about this myself, because it's a very, very hard thing to convene and to hear those personal insights. But I think, it's upon us as women to speak out and to speak as loudly as we can, to mobilise this conversation. And let's hope that we will get the support that we need for the women on the ground who are suffering enormously because of the impacts of climate change, and they have done nothing to contribute to that. So with that, I just want to thank you for listening, for attending. I know it's been a long COP, and this is probably, it's a late evening, but please do, keep in touch and let us know how we can work together. So my sincere thanks to everyone, and a very good evening.